Hi everyone. In today's class, I want to talk to you about evolutionary theory and the creationists. So, I just want to look at a brief moment in history. You don't have to write down what is on this particular slide. I just want to give you a background in terms of how people thought of change, especially in terms of how animals and organisms change. So, the idea that species being able to change through time isn't a new idea. It's actually been around since ancient Rome, uh, even in Greece and in ancient China. The idea reemerged in the early 18th and 19th century with several different scientists, physicians, and philosophers. These people are like James Hutton and Charles Lyell. So the first two here, their basic contribution to evolution was they were able to determine that Earth's natural processes took millions of years, okay, to change. So things like tectonic plates, erosion. Thomas Malthus, he basically figured that disease, population sizes, all of that are factors that help to drive evolution to control human population. So if a population gets too big, resources will run out. People will have to compete for food. People will get more sick. Okay, so all that kind of stuff in terms of population size and control came from Malthus. And then Erasmus Darwin, he basically believed that competition was always a necessary factor in making sure that species fight to survive, because through that competition, that will bring about change in a species. Now, the three that are at the bottom here that have been bolded, those are the ones that I will look at in a little bit more detail. We have Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Charles Darwin. We will also look at the creationists as well. So, as a side note here for now, creationism is just a religious belief that the earth, the universe, life, and all humans were created supernaturally by a divine being within the last 10,000 years. So, we'll actually look at the creationists um, on their own a little bit later. All right, so this is where you can actually start your notes. In order for evolution to work, okay, there has to be some conditions that are in place. So first of all, the Earth must be more than 10,000 years old. Okay, we know that today the Earth is billions of years old. Okay, so we've got that part covered. Natural changes may take millions of years. Okay, we've known um, since the last century that tectonic plates slowly move across the Earth. We know that erosion takes place. We know that um, a lot of different natural processes do take millions of years. So change doesn't happen all at once. They can, but a lot of Earth's natural processes takes millions of years to develop. We also know that competition and sexual selection, okay, that means the choice of mate, can lead to change. Okay, and this is kind of exemplified from our little labs in adaptation and competition, okay, in terms for resources and for mates. So with competition, okay, and evolution, both of these can drive a species to develop and change. There are two things that allow a species to survive in a world where there is a limited amount of resource and health. So with fewer resources, there'll be higher competition. Okay, with higher competition, okay, and lower resources, that could lead to poor health. While certain types of animals with better adaptations, okay, they might survive better. They may get the resources they need, and they may actually be quite healthy or fit. So in that case, we may see evolution or change happen within that particular branch of species. Now, all of this just lays the framework. Okay, in order for evolution to work. We still haven't talked about how does evolution work. Okay, that was actually left to two individuals. Here we have Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Okay, he was one of the scientists who developed an idea in terms of how evolution might work in biological organisms. Okay, another scientist with also another very brilliant idea is Charles Robert Darwin. This is the Charles Darwin that you guys are mostly familiar with. Okay, he's the grandson of Erasmus Darwin. Okay, so both of these guys have two very different theories, okay, in terms of how evolution works. So let's get at it. So when we say mechanism of evolution, we basically mean how does evolution work. So J.B. Lamarck, his proposed mechanism was simply this. He called it the theory of acquired characteristics. Some people nowadays just call it the use-disuse theory, and you'll kind of see why it's called that in a few minutes. Lamarck basically believed that an organism can pass on their traits and characteristics that it has acquired during its lifetime to its offspring. Okay, so when you kind of think about this on its own, you might think, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. I've taken heredity. It's true that the parent can pass on their characteristics to the offspring. But this isn't what he means. Okay? What he means is if you were able to develop a characteristic that you have genetically, okay, and make it better during your lifetime, okay, that sort of growth would also be passed on to the offspring. So he believed that organisms are driven to become more and more complex through evolution. That evolution's goal is to make more complicated organisms as time moves on. Okay. Now, we kind of know that this isn't true. Okay. The point of evolution isn't to perfect an organism or make it more complicated. The whole idea of evolution is for an organism to become better suited or adapted to its current environment. So let's look at a couple examples that Lamarck has put out here to try and support his theory of acquired characteristics. So Lamarck believed that giraffes evolved their long necks while stretching their necks longer and longer to reach higher food sources. So let's look at an image here. Over on the far left, you see a short-necked giraffe, which Lamarck believed is the ancestor to the modern-day giraffe, okay, the ones with the long neck. So what he proposed was, as long as the giraffe keeps stretching its neck higher and higher in order to reach a food source, in this case, tree leaves, that were higher and higher up on the tree, that eventually, okay, as one parent passes their genes to the next offspring, all that stretching and development that the parent giraffe has acquired during its lifetime will be passed on to the offspring, and that offspring would stretch its neck, okay, longer and longer during its lifetime, and then all that extra stretching gets passed on to its offspring, and so on until we get to a giraffe that has a really long neck. So when I explain it like this, you can see how ridiculous that sounds. But back in his day, this was a pretty valid concept, okay, for how evolution might work, because it made a sense to a lot of people. Now, Lamarck's theory, we know, is not true, okay? Because if you kind of think of it the opposite way, if an animal doesn't use a body part, that body part would not be transferred to the offspring, right? So another scientist by the name of Weissman, what he did was he had an experiment where he cuts off the tail of a mouse, okay? He cut off thousands of mice tails just to prove that in no scenario will their offspring be born with a shorter tail or with no tail. Okay? So cut after cut, future mice should have a shorter tail or no tail, but the thing is, all future mice had tails. And we know that it's the gene, okay, that needs to be affected. Cutting off the tail of a mouse doesn't affect the gene which gives that mouse its tail. Okay? As long as the gene is still present and that mouse passes on its genes to its future offspring, the offspring will have the instructions for making a new tail. So with this one experiment, it actually showed that Lamarck's theory or mechanism is not true. It's false. It's busted. So let's look at Darwin's. Darwin has been credited as the father of evolution. Okay. Now, he does have a couple of highlights. Okay. I'm sure that at some point in your life you would have heard of the Voyage of the Beagle that Charles Darwin went on. He was basically a medical school dropout, couldn't stand the sight of blood. Okay. He married his cousin Emma, and he is the author of his book on the origin of species, published in 1859. Now, his proposed mechanism, okay, which he introduced in his book on the origin of species, is basically called evolution by natural selection. Darwin's evolution by means of natural selection looks like this. Darwin believes evolution, or an organism, can gradually change into a new species over time. Okay. Now, when we say an organism can gradually change, we're talking about a population of organisms, okay, of that species gradually changing into a new species over time. Okay, because again, evolution doesn't occur in a single organism. It occurs across an entire population. Okay. So he believed if an organism's adaptation were to help it to survive, then Mother Nature would select for that particular characteristic or trait. So if that organism survives because of their adaptation, future offsprings will also have that particular trait. Okay. Now, over millions of years, okay, that species would eventually evolve to be better suited for the environment that it's currently in, not necessarily evolving to be more complex. Okay. So the main idea is a species is always going to be better suited for its environment if it is fit or successful. So let's go back to the giraffes. So under Darwin's mechanism of evolution, okay, you actually have a whole bunch of giraffes in a population. Okay, and everyone looks different, right? Because they have different heights, different length of necks, okay, different characteristics, all making up that individual giraffe. So you have some giraffes that have shorter necks, you have some giraffes with longer necks, and then you have some giraffes with very long necks, etc. These long-necked giraffes are basically came about from a mutation. So all of these natural mutations that pop up in a population, okay, if there are a few of them that have this mutation for having a longer neck, okay, that would be perhaps advantageous, okay, but only depending on the environment. So the idea is if the food source became harder to reach, okay, then short-necked giraffes has a disadvantage. Okay, because their necks are shorter, they won't be able to eat, they will eventually die off. Whereas the giraffes with longer necks, they would still be able to eat. Okay, for them, having that long neck adaptation is advantageous. So therefore, they survive. And since they survive, their genes are passed on to the next generation, and the next generation would look more like their great grandparents, which had longer necks. Okay, so eventually, if this continues on, more and more giraffes will have longer necks. So even if we look at giraffes today, okay, they do have long necks, and we still see that there are still some giraffes that may have a slightly longer neck than another giraffe, and that's fine, okay, because there is a natural amount of variation. Okay? So in time, only the long neck giraffes survived, okay, compared to the short, like the really short neck giraffes. Okay, so what we say is this particular adaptation of having a longer neck was actually useful, so nature selected that particular organism to survive. So with natural selection, okay, doing all the work in the background, the idea of evolution is actually successful. Okay, it's quite well supported. It's easy to understand. Okay, um, there doesn't seem to be any problems. Okay, in terms of interpreting the history, okay, of life on Earth through this particular mechanism. Okay, we can use it to explain how certain animals could evolve the way they did. So a couple of side notes. Before Darwin published his ideas on natural selection, there was another scientist named Alfred Wallace. Okay, he actually came up with the same idea, okay, on his own, so independently. And Darwin was never going to publish his ideas, okay, because he was a very religious person, and he had this internal conflict, this internal struggle with the ideas of God and with his own, from what his own ideas and what science is kind of telling him. So it was Charles Lyell, okay, the guy who helped supported that the Earth is actually more than 10,000 years old. Okay, he was also a book publisher, and he encouraged Darwin to publish his book, okay, in 1859, okay, before Wallace could publish his own paper. So, with a little help from Lyell, Darwin actually published his book. Alfred Wallace also published some books. They all had the same idea. Nowadays, they are both credited with the theory of natural selection, okay, as the means for how evolution works. So, if we were to break down Darwinian evolution, okay, the theory has to be based on several key things. Now, there's about 6 or 7 of them, okay, 6 or 7 points in his type of evolution. So, 1, overproduction. An organism tends to produce more offspring than necessary. Okay, so in order for evolution to work, this idea of overproduction must happen basically to all life on Earth. All life must tend to overproduce more than what they should. Competition has to be present. Large populations will cause competition for resources. So it's not to say that small populations don't compete, okay, but if small populations don't compete, or even if large populations don't compete, there's likely not going to be rapid change. Okay, evolution will still occur; it will just occur even more slowly. There must be variation. Okay, that means that each individual must differ from all the other members of its own species. Okay, so this allows us to have certain types of mutations present. Okay, because you never know when those mutations could be useful in the future. Adaptations. Because of your variations, okay, some variations can help organisms to become better suited to their environment, okay, than others. So if you are more suited, then that variation that you have is actually an adaptation, a good adaptation. Natural selection must always be occurring. So natural selection always chooses the best adapted organism to survive and therefore to reproduce. Speciation must also occur. So new species are formed from ancestral species by means of natural selection. Okay? Now, with all of those different points in place, evolution occurs. But even today, okay, we do have people who don't believe that evolution is happening. So this is our section about the creationists. A creationist is a person who strongly believes that the universe and all of its organisms originate by acts of divine creation. Okay, so basically a single deity that had created all life and everything in the universe. Now, their main source of reference is the book of Genesis, okay, and not any other creationist myth or legend. So even in my culture, we have a god named Pangu who basically was born out of a giant egg and his entire body created the universe. Okay, because that story is not in the book of Genesis, my ancestors' creationist legend or myths don't apply. It's just a story for them. Okay, but whatever is written in the book of Genesis, they basically cite that as truth and fact. So when you look at who these creationists are, okay, they're just basically regular everyday people. Okay, but I've found at least three, I would say, important creationists. Okay, these people, I'll give you a description of who they are and what they do and what their kind of connection is to the whole creationist movement. So the first one is Philip Johnson. He's a law professor and he is the father of the intelligent design movement, okay, which is basically a branch of creationism that we find in our modern day society. The middle dude is Ray Bolin. He's a molecular cell biologist and member of the Discovery Institute. Okay, so he's an actual biologist. Okay, now the Discovery Institute is basically a museum for creationists. Okay, this is where they have all their displays and proof and support for what the world is like when, like under the book of Genesis. Okay, so their museum actually is based on an Earth that's 10,000 years old. Okay, it's based on a time where humans and dinosaurs and all the other animals are living in existence simultaneously. And the last guy, this guy is Jerry Bergman. Okay, he's a professor of biomedicine, so he's an actual doctor as well. And his involvement is that he's a member of the Young Earth Creationists. So the Young Earth Creationists are basically the modern version of the creationists that we have today. All of these people here, okay, are basically representative of a very extreme group of people. Okay, so I'm not saying that anyone who's religious is basically a creationist, but these people here, they totally believe 100% that whatever is written in the book of Genesis in terms of how the universe and all life on earth was created, that is to be true. Okay, now here's a little cartoon that kind of sums up what the creationist beliefs and points of views are. So it's not real science. Real science means that you have to be able to come up with ideas and then have evidence to support your ideas, and you also have to be open to the idea that your theory might be wrong. Okay, when you ask the creationists if they are wrong or if there's any chance of them being wrong, they will always say no. Okay, because from their point of view, their deity, their God, is never wrong. And if it's written in the book here, then it must be true. So again, my job is not to sway you to either side. I'm just here to present the science of evolution. And if you're interested in learning more about evolution and the creationists and their little debates that they've had over the centuries, I will post a few videos through Google Classroom so that you can watch all these debates. All right, see you guys soon.